Today's mindful moment. They say history is written by the victors. But what if history was completely fabricated? Not just, a little biased, but a whole reality manufactured by the state.
Mm-hmm.
That was life in the Soviet Union. Questioning the official narrative. Big mistake. Could land you in some serious trouble.
Yeah.
Today we're diving into David Remnick's Lenin's Tomb.
Okay.
A chilling look at how the Soviet Empire was built on lies and how those lies ultimately led to its collapse.
It's incredible how the Soviet regime's control over history went so far.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just about censoring information.
Right.
It was about shaping the very perception of reality for millions of people.
Right.
They went to extraordinary lengths to maintain this facade, building KGB vacation homes near mass graves of their victims.
Oh, wow.
Just to keep a watchful eye on the evidence.
So that nobody would stumble across it.
Exactly.
That's wild. So where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, it all starts with Gorbachev. His decision to reveal the blank spots of Soviet history, the atrocities that had been swept under the rug for decades.
Yeah.
That was like opening Pandora's box.
Right.
He thought he could control the narrative, but those revelations unleashed a force he couldn't contain.
Yeah, once that truth starts to come out, there's no way to put it back in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The return of historical memory really exposed the brutality and the corruption of the Communist Party.
Right.
Shattering that carefully constructed image they had projected for so long. Like, for example, the excavation of mass graves in Katyn revealed the remains of thousands of Polish officers.
Oh, wow.
They were massacred by the Soviets, a crime that they had blamed on the Nazis for years.
I can only imagine the shock and outrage that must have caused.
Yeah, it was a watershed moment. People started to question everything they had been told.
Right.
And the regime's credibility crumbled.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about abstract historical events, though, was it?
No, not at all.
This was about real people, the human cost of these lies.
Exactly.
How did ordinary citizens grapple with these revelations?
Imagine living in a world where you couldn't even talk about what happened to your own family.
All right.
During Stalin's purges, countless people simply vanished.
Yeah.
Families were left with this gaping hole in their lives, this trauma they couldn't even speak about for fear of, sharing the same fate.
It's just heartbreaking to think about that, the weight of that silence.
Remnick tells a poignant story of a family in Moscow who decided to break that silence. They chose to tell their children the truth about Stalin's crimes, even though it put their own safety at risk.
Right.
But they knew they couldn't let their children grow up believing the regime's propaganda.
That must have taken immense courage. What motivated them to take such a risk?
I think it speaks to the power of truth and the deep human need to acknowledge and understand our past, even the painful parts. And they weren't alone.
Right.
Despite the risks, more and more individuals started to challenge the official narrative, demanding accountability for the regime's crimes.
So you had these individual acts of courage.
Yeah.
But was there a wider movement of dissent emerging at this time?
Absolutely. Dissidents like Pavel Litvinov and Larisa Bogoraz risked their freedom to speak out against the regime's repression. They organized protests, distributed samizdat literature, and drew inspiration from writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn,
Right.
whose works expose the horrors of the gulag system.
It's amazing how even in a system as repressive as the Soviet Union, people found ways to resist, to keep the flame of truth burning.
It's true, these acts of defiance, however small they may have seemed at the time, chipped away at the regime's authority and helped to create the conditions for the changes that were to come.
Which brings us to the Gorbachev era.
Yeah.
He didn't initially set out to dismantle the Soviet system, did he?
No, his aim was to reform the system from within.
Right.
But his policies of Glasnost and Perestroika, openness and restructuring, unintentionally unleashed a torrent of information and dissent that he couldn't control.
It's like he opened a window hoping to let in a gentle breeze and a hurricane came rushing through.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the media was allowed to expose the country's economic woes, environmental disasters like Chernobyl, and the staggering level of corruption within the party.
Right.
For instance, an article in Moscow News revealed the horrific extent of child malnutrition in Turkmenistan,
Oh, wow.
shattering the illusion of prosperity the regime had so carefully crafted.
So the cracks were starting to show, the truth was seeping out, and the world was watching, right?
Absolutely. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, inspired by events in Eastern Europe, intensified their push for independence. They leveraged historical events like the anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, long suppressed by the Soviets, to mobilize protests and demands for autonomy.
What's fascinating is how they used history, a tool that had been used to control them, to fuel their fight for freedom.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is a powerful weapon. It can be used to oppress, but it can also be used to liberate. And in this case, it was a catalyst for change, not just in the Baltics, but across the entire Soviet Empire.
And this is where things start to get really interesting with the emergence of a new figure on the political landscape, Boris Yeltsin.
Yes, Yeltsin was a charismatic and ambitious politician who saw an opportunity in the growing public frustration with the slow pace of reform. He positioned himself as a champion of democratic change, a man of the people, and his popularity soared.
Yeah, he was a stark contrast to Gorbachev, wasn't he? More assertive, more willing to challenge the old guard.
Definitely, yeah. You could see this contrast play out in a dramatic fashion during the 1990 May Day parade on Red Square.
Right.
Protesters openly denounced the Communist Party and called for its downfall, while Yeltsin stood defiant, a symbol of the changing tides.
So the stage was set for a showdown.
Indeed, the old guard, the hardliners within the Communist Party, were terrified of losing their grip on power. They knew their time was running out, and they were desperate to hold on.
And that desperation led to a drastic and ultimately fatal gamble, the coup of 1991.
Yes, the coup was a last-ditch attempt to seize control, to roll back the reforms, and reassert the party's dominance. But it backfired spectacularly.
And that failure, I imagine, was a turning point, a sign that the Soviet system was truly broken beyond repair.
Absolutely. The coup exposed the deep divisions within Soviet society, the fragility of the regime's control, and the public's growing thirst for truth and freedom.
Yeah.
It was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Empire. So we left off with a failed coup of 1991, a desperate gamble by hardliners that backfired in a big way.
Yeah, it really does feel like the coup was a turning point, a sign that that system was beyond saving. But beyond the political drama, what was happening on the ground, like in the hearts and minds of ordinary people during this time?
It's like a society waking up from a decades-long slumber.
Right.
Rubbing its eyes and trying to make sense of this new reality.
Right.
You know, the old certainties were gone,
Yeah.
replaced by a mix of hope, fear, and confusion.
Yeah, I bet. This
Yeah.
wasn't just about changing leaders. This was about changing an entire worldview.
Exactly. And it's really fascinating to see how this shift played out culturally. You know, figures who had been completely erased from Soviet history,
Yeah.
demonized or just forgotten, suddenly reemerged.
Right.
One really striking example is Nikolai Bukharin.
Bukharin, remind me who he was.
So he was a Bolshevik revolutionary,
Yep.
once a close ally of Lenin,
Okay.
but he opposed Stalin's brutality and was executed during the Great Purge.
Right.
His name was taboo for decades, a symbol of opposition to the party line.
So what changed? Why was he suddenly allowed back into the narrative?
Well, Gorbachev saw in Bukharin a potential alternative path for socialism.
Oh.
He represented a less totalitarian, more economically focused vision.
Right.
Rehabilitating Bukharin was a way for Gorbachev to distance himself from Stalin's legacy and signal his commitment to reform.
But wasn't that a really risky move? I mean,
Right.
questioning Stalin's legacy could unravel the whole foundation of the Soviet state.
Oh, absolutely. It ignited fierce debates within the party and across society.
Mm-hmm.
Some people saw it as a betrayal of communist ideals, while others welcomed it as a long overdue reckoning with the past.
It's almost like the ghost of Stalin was still haunting the Soviet Union, even after all these years.
It's a powerful image, and it wasn't just Stalin.
Yeah.
Suddenly, writers who had been banned for decades, like Anna Akhmatova, Mikhail Bulgakov, Boris Pasternak, were being published and celebrated.
Wow.
It was this period of incredible cultural rediscovery.
It must have been like opening a treasure chest of forbidden knowledge.
Mhm.
What impact did this have on society at large?
Well, imagine an entire generation being exposed to ideas and art they never knew existed.
Mm.
It was exhilarating, but also disorienting. People
Ugh.
were questioning everything they had been taught, reevaluating their values, and imagining a very different future.
It sounds like a time of tremendous upheaval, both exciting and terrifying.
Definitely. There was a sense that anything was possible, but also a fear of the unknown,
Right.
of losing the familiar, however flawed it may have been.
And amidst all this change, there was still the looming question of the Communist Party.
Right.
It had been the backbone of the Soviet system for so long. What was to become of it?
That was the million-ruble question, wasn't it? Opinions were very divided. Some, like Alexander Yakovlev, argued that the party was inherently corrupt and needed to be completely dismantled.
He must have seen it as a cancer that needed to be cut out to save the patient.
That's a good analogy. But others, including Gorbachev himself, believed that the party could be reformed, transformed into a force for democratic change.
Right.
They argued for a more gradual approach, a kind of controlled demolition.
But the failed coup showed that the hardliners weren't willing to go down without a fight.
No.
They still held positions of power, didn't they?
Yes, and that created a very dangerous situation.
Yeah.
The old guard was like a wounded animal lashing out in fear and desperation.
Right.
They couldn't accept the loss of their power and privilege.
And on top of all this internal turmoil, you also had the rise of nationalist movements in the republics. How did they fit into this complex picture?
Well, the Soviet Union was an empire built on the suppression of national identities.
Right.
And as the central authority weakened these suppressed desires for autonomy and independence, they just erupted with renewed force.
So the empire was being pulled apart from the inside and the outside.
Exactly. The situation in the Baltics was particularly tense. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia had been forcibly annexed into the Soviet Union in 1940.
Right.
Their yearning for freedom had never died, and now they saw a chance to break free.
But breaking free wouldn't be easy.
No.
I mean, the Soviet regime had shown time and again that it was willing to use violence to maintain control.
Tragically, you're right. The events in Vilnius in January 1991, where Soviet troops killed unarmed civilians protesting for independence, were a stark reminder of the brutality the regime was still capable of.
Those events must have sent shockwaves through the entire Soviet Union. I mean, it's hard to imagine the fear and uncertainty people must have felt.
Yeah, it was a time of intense anxiety.
Yeah.
On the one hand, there was this hope for a better future, for a more democratic and just society.
Right.
But on the other hand, there was this very real fear of violence, of chaos, of the unknown.
And let's not forget the economic crisis that was unfolding as well.
Right.
Decades of mismanagement had left the Soviet economy on the brink of collapse.
People were standing in lines for hours just to get basic necessities.
Wow.
Inflation was skyrocketing. The old system simply wasn't working anymore.
It's almost like all the pillars of the Soviet system were crumbling simultaneously. Political authority, economic stability, social cohesion. It's no wonder the whole edifice came crashing down.
It was this perfect storm of historical forces, social movements, and individual choices.
Yeah.
And as the old order crumbled, a new breed of entrepreneur emerged, eager to seize the opportunities of a nascent market economy.
So this is where we see the rise of figures like German Sterligov, right?
Yes.
He founded the Elisa Trading Company, which quickly became one of the most successful businesses in the country.
Yeah, Sterligov really represents this new generation of Russians who were disillusioned with communist ideology and eager to embrace the possibilities of capitalism.
Right.
They were driven, ambitious, and willing to take risks.
But this transition to a market economy wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
The lack of clear regulations, the legacy of corruption, the rise of organized crime created this Wild West atmosphere.
Wow.
Fortunes were made and lost overnight. The lines between legitimate business and criminal activity were often blurred.
It sounds like a chaotic and dangerous time. How did ordinary people cope with this sudden shift to a completely different economic system?
For many, it was a painful and disorienting experience. They had to adapt to a whole new set of rules.
Right.
A new way of life that emphasized individual initiative and competition rather than the collectivist ideals they had been raised with.
It's like being thrown into the deep end of the pool and having to learn to swim. Some people thrived, but others struggled to stay afloat.
Exactly. And this uneven distribution of wealth and opportunity led to new social problems.
Yeah.
The gap between the rich and the poor widened.
Right.
A new class of oligarchs emerged, wielding immense political and economic power.
So while the collapse of the Soviet Union brought about freedom and opportunity for some, it also created new inequalities and challenges.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even revolutions with the noblest of intentions can have unintended consequences.
Right.
The transition from communism to capitalism was a messy and complex process, and its legacy is still being debated today.
And one of the most contentious aspects of this legacy is the ongoing debate about the role of the Communist Party in Soviet history.
Right, after the failed coup, there were calls to hold the party accountable for its crimes.
Yeah.
A series of trials were held, televised, and widely followed to really examine its history and legacy.
These trials must have been so dramatic. It's like putting the ghosts of the Soviet system on trial.
They were. They offered a glimpse into the inner workings of the Soviet system, the mentality of those who had been at its helm.
Yeah. We heard testimonies from victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. It was a painful but necessary process of confronting the past. But could those trials truly bring closure to such a traumatic chapter in history?
That's debatable.
Yeah.
Even today, Russia's relationship with its Soviet past is complex and fraught with conflicting narratives.
Right.
Some people yearn for the stability and predictability of the old order,
Yeah.
while others embrace the freedoms and opportunities of the post-Soviet era.
It seems like the ghost of the Soviet Union is still very much present in Russia today, shaping its identity and its future.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present and influence our future, even as we try to move forward.
And speaking of trying to understand the past, I'm reminded of Mindful Moments, an AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel.
Okay.
They do these really insightful breakdowns of complex topics, including history. It's a great way to delve deeper into these issues and gain new perspectives.
Yeah, I agree. Resources like that can be invaluable in helping us navigate the complexities of history and the human experience.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm left wondering, what did the average person on the street actually think about all this upheaval? How did they experience this tumultuous period, not just politically, but personally?
That's a great question, and it's one that Remnick explores in detail in the final chapters of Lenin's Tomb. He takes us into the homes and hearts of ordinary Russians as they grapple with the collapse of their world and the uncertain future that lies ahead.
I'm eager to delve into those personal stories and see how this grand historical drama played out on a human scale.
Me too. Join us for part 3 as we explore the final chapter of the Soviet story and its lasting impact on the lives of those who lived through it.
So we've been exploring the collapse of the Soviet Empire through David Remnick's Lenin's Tomb.
Yeah.
And it has been a wild ride.
It has.
From unearthing hidden truths to witnessing the rise of new leaders, it feels like we've lived through a historical thriller.
It really does have that dramatic arc, doesn't it? And as we move into this final chapter of the story, we see a nation grappling with its newfound freedom.
Right.
But also haunted by the ghosts of its past.
And speaking of freedom, one of the most dramatic shifts in this era was the emergence of independent media. Suddenly, newspapers and TV weren't just mouthpieces for the party.
Right.
How did this explosion of information shape public perception?
It was a complete paradigm shift. I mean, think about it. For decades, people had been fed this carefully curated version of reality.
Right.
And now they're bombarded with this cacophony of voices, opinions, and perspectives. It was chaotic, confusing, but also exhilarating.
It must have been like someone flipped a switch and suddenly the world was in Technicolor.
Exactly. Papers like Moscow News and Ogonyok magazines like Literarnaya Gazeta, they were all challenging the official narrative, exposing corruption and giving voice to dissent.
Wow.
It was a heady time for journalism,
Yeah.
and it played a crucial role in shaping the public discourse.
But wasn't it also kind of dangerous? I mean, the old guard still had a lot of power.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't they try to push back against this newfound freedom of the press?
Absolutely. They saw this free flow of information as a direct threat to their authority.
Right.
And, some tried to cling to the old ways,
Yeah.
using their remaining influence to censor or discredit dissenting voices.
So you had this tug of war
Yeah.
between the forces of openness and the forces of control.
Precisely. And one of the most chilling examples of this struggle was the rise of Alexander Nevzorov
Right.
and his television program, 600 Seconds.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Nevzorov. He was a master manipulator, wasn't he?
Oh, he was a brilliant propagandist.
Yeah.
He used sensationalist reporting and outright fabrication to demonize the pro-independence movements in the Baltics.
Right.
Even going so far as to justify the violence in Vilnius.
It's a reminder that even in a time of great change, the forces of fear and division can exploit the chaos for their own ends.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of critical thinking.
Right.
Especially in an era of information overload.
Yeah.
People had to learn to discern fact from fiction, to question the narratives being presented to them.
It's a lesson that's as relevant today as it was then.
Absolutely.
We're constantly bombarded with information.
Yeah.
Much of it designed to manipulate or mislead.
That's right. The Soviet experience really serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when truth is suppressed and critical thinking is stifled.
Yeah.
It's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the turmoil, the fear, the uncertainty, people found ways to adapt,
Yeah.
to make sense of this new world,
Yeah.
to build new lives for themselves.
Remnick captures this beautifully in his book.
Yeah.
He doesn't just focus on the grand political narratives.
Right.
He zooms in on the individual stories, the human faces behind the historical events.
Gives a real sense of the human cost of everything that happened.
Exactly. Like he tells the story of this young woman, for instance, who had always dreamed of becoming a doctor.
Yeah.
But her ambitions were thwarted by the rigid Soviet system.
Right.
With the collapse of the old order, she finally gets her chance to pursue her dream.
That's great.
And then there's the former factory worker who, faced with unemployment,
Right.
turns his woodworking hobby into a successful business.
Wow.
These are just a couple of examples of how ordinary people navigated this really extraordinary period of change.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams, their struggles.
Absolutely. And as we conclude our deep dive into Lenin's tomb, I'm struck by the enduring power of truth.
Yeah.
You know, the Soviet system was built on lies on a carefully constructed facade
Right.
that eventually crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions.
It's a reminder that no matter how powerful a regime or ideology may seem, the truth has a way of eventually breaking through.
It also highlights the courage of those who dared to speak truth to power, who risked their freedom and even their lives to challenge the lies and expose the injustices of the system.
Their stories are so inspiring, a real testament to the enduring human spirit and the power of hope, even in the darkest of times.
And as we reflect on the lessons of the Soviet collapse,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that history isn't just something that happened in the past.
Right.
It's a living, breathing thing that shapes our present and influences our future.
So what can we learn from this particular chapter of history?
Mm-hmm.
What insights can we glean from the Soviet experience that might help us navigate the complexities of our own time?
I think one of the key takeaways is the importance of vigilance,
Yeah.
of never taking our freedoms for granted.
Right.
You know, we need to be aware of the forces that seek to manipulate us, to control the narrative, to stifle dissent.
We also need to be critical consumers of information,
Yes.
to question the sources we rely on, and to be open to diverse perspectives.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that history is made by people.
Right.
By individuals who make choices, who take risks, who fight for what they believe in.
Yeah.
Their stories remind us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, change is possible.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the rise and fall of the Soviet Empire through David Remnick's masterful storytelling.
I agree. It's a book that I highly recommend to anyone interested in understanding not just Soviet history, but the human condition itself.
And for those who are looking for more deep dives into history, culture, and ideas, be sure to check out Mindful Moments, an AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel that offers insightful breakdowns of complex topics.
It's a great resource for anyone who wants to continue exploring the big questions and stories that shape our world.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into Lenin's tomb, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this episode with a friend.
And if you're eager to delve deeper into this fascinating period of history, you can purchase your own copy of Lenin's Tomb at link.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through history. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the ideas and events that shape our world.